do all organisms, such as humans, animals, plants, have the same common ancestor?
I mean, Darwin expected that as the fossil record became more complete in succeeding years, there'd be innumerable transition species between, the major orders, the families, the genera. Eventually, there'd be a complete evolutionary tree leading from humans back to a single common ancestor. After more than 150 years now, that just hasn't happened. Very few, if any, transitional species have been found. The norm for the fossil record is that new species appear abruptly, fully formed in the fossil record. They remain unchanged while they're there, and then they abruptly disappear. Evolutionary paleontologists don't dispute this. There's the Cambrian explosion, the angiosperm big bloom. Cambrian explosion, more than half of all the known basic kinds of creatures suddenly appeared then with no known ancestors. The angiosperm big bloom, flowering plants suddenly appeared. There was the so-called explosion of mammals, the explosive appearance of birds. All these are well attested, well known, and that's the norm in the fossil record. Even those comparatively few supposed transitional forms that are widely touted in books haven't really stood up well. You may have heard of Tiktaalik. Neil Shubin and his co-workers, they found a fish with fins that they felt were a bit more like feet in Devonian strata in the Canadian Arctic, in rocks that were dated to about 370, 380 million years ago. And they claimed that it came on land to catch insects and evolved into the first quadrupeds. Now, there's an obvious problem about that because, fish reproduction involves the fish taking up what's called a nuptial embrace. The two fish embrace one another, and this can only take place in water. It needs water to support this nuptial embrace. So how could Tiktaalik have reproduced on land? But anyway, this was touted as a huge triumph for evolutionary theory. Then, however, footprints of undoubted quadrupeds were discovered in strata that were millions of years older than where Tiktaalik was found. So this demonstrated that it can't be an intermediate species between fish and amphibians or other land creatures. Then whales, you can find in museums the story about how 50 million years ago, one species of land mammal went back into the water and evolved into whales. And it's claimed that whale fossils provide one of the grandest and most complete demonstrations of animal evolution. They're supposed to be fossils all the way from land-dwelling quadrupeds through intermediate walking whales, right through to true whales. Our museums show pictures and reconstructions. There are three supposed intermediate walking whales called Pachycetus, Ambulocetus, and Rhodocetus. The fossils were supposed to show blowholes and ear bones with projections that are known as sigmoid processes, which are typical for whales. And the artists' reconstructions depicted feet intermediate between hoofs and flippers, said to be a triumph of evolutionary theory. Problem is that the museum exhibit, there are reconstructions, they're just reconstructions. And Pachycetus's skull was made from just a few fossil fragments. When more complete fossils were found, it was discovered that Pachycetus had no blowhole and no sigmoid process. The fossilized feet bones eventually found indicated that the creature was purely a land animal, not an intermediate at all. And the Ambulocetus story was exactly the same. The fossil feature that they claimed was a sigmoid process was nothing like that of a whale, and many experts dismissed the supposed whale characteristics as an illusion. As for Rhodoccetus, it's shown with flippers and a whale-like fluke, but these were just added by the artist. There's no corresponding fossil bones that have ever been found. Excuse me. It's sad that museums keep on displaying these exhibits when the evidence to support them really just isn't there. Beware of artists' impressions and reconstructions because they're coloured by evolutionary biases. I said that evolutionist scientists readily admit about the missing links, and to account for this, Stephen Gould and others came up with a hypothesis called punctuated equilibria. They suggested that new species arise when a small population becomes isolated at the margin of where the parent species originally lived, and that in this small population, new species would arise rapidly. The new species would then become unable to mate and reproduce with the parent species, and it would migrate to where the ancestors once lived. So there'd be few fossils of these intermediates because of the small numbers. But there should be some intermediates. There are problems with this hypothesis. There should be some intermediates, especially between major groups like vertebrates and intermediates. Then this hypothesis has no mechanism to explain the rapid evolution in the isolated communities. You know, new genes are required for new organs or new body plans. Where did these genes come from? Punctuated equilibrium gives no explanation. It's not been that popular with evolutionary biologists. The situation has been the same with human evolution. Intermediates between apes and Homo sapiens are seriously lacking. Australopithecines, on the one hand, are very ape-like. Then there's Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and then fully Homo sapiens. The only supposed intermediate is Homo habilis, but there are very, very few fossils of Homo habilis, and many paleontologists dispute that it's a species at all. They think that it's just a mixture of ape and Homo material. Now, Homo erectus and Neanderthal are really fully Homo sapiens. You know, Neanderthal DNA has been found amongst living people today. You and I probably have amounts of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, and so Neanderthals were fully human, and Homo erectus are very difficult to distinguish from Neanderthal. And they're associated with fire and tools and so on, just as the same as Neanderthals. It's rather likely that Neanderthals and these species were just fully Homo adapted for very cold conditions during the Ice Age. So again, the intermediates, the many intermediates that would be needed between ape and human are just lacking. I know you'll hear people saying that ape DNA and human DNA is 98% the same, but that's been completely overturned by modern research. That data came out from very early study of ape and human genomes, and nowadays, it's well recognized that there are major differences, at least 70% difference between ape DNA, let's say chimpanzee DNA, and human DNA, and more than 70% for some parts of the genome. So many intermediates between apes, between chimpanzees, say, and Homo would be needed, but they're simply not there. I think possibly another relevant thing is that, you know, they've tried to find the tree of life, Darwin's tree of life, the phylogenetic tree, the common ancestors, by means of DNA analysis, looking at how what the DNA from one species is related to the DNA of another species. And machines for sequencing DNA became available 10 or 20 years ago and became common 10 years ago. And people can make now their own phylogenetic trees by looking at DNA sequencing. And they expected that the trees of life that DNA sequencing would produce would be the same as the tree of life that was produced by looking at fossil and species anatomies, looking at their morphology. But in fact, that isn't the case, and the disagreements are very, very serious, and there's seldom much correspondence, beyond species that are very similar, beyond races that are very similar. The divergences have been very, 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 very serious. And scientists are talking not about a tree of life, but a forest of life, and so on. And this has been a big blow for the evolutionary hypothesis, such that believing in a common ancestor is now becoming pretty difficult. All the gaps are there, and as I say, DNA sequencing didn't agree with the tree of life, which is produced by anatomical comparisons.
Thank you so much, Professor Walton.